A millionaire rescued two poor children abandoned on the street. Immediately, the police came knocking on his door. The city lights shimmered with their usual brilliance on that frigid winter night. The towering skyscrapers loomed like silent giants against the dark sky, their glowing windows resembling man-made stars piercing through the blackness. Theodore Gross sat behind the wheel of his sleek red Ferrari, gazing at the urban landscape with a distant expression, barely aware of the warmth inside the car, shielding him from the bitter cold outside. At 40, Theodore had achieved everything society deemed the pinnacle of success. His business empire spanned continents, his name was a regular feature in prestigious business magazines, and his bank account boasted more digits than most people could fathom in a lifetime. Yet, as he drove through the city streets, a familiar emptiness weighed on his chest. Maybe I should take a different route tonight, he thought suddenly. The idea suddenly came to him, an odd impulse that defied his usual routines. For a moment he hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel as he considered this small act of rebellion against his rigid habits. The Theodore Gross of old would have dismissed the thought without a second glance. But tonight, he turned the wheel to the right, steering into quieter streets. The luxurious high-rises gave way to humbler buildings, the vibrant lights dimmed, and the cityscape transformed into something entirely different. When was the last time I came to this part of town? He murmured to himself, slowing the car to take in the unfamiliar surroundings. The night grew colder, and a fine mist began to settle, wrapping the streetlights in ghostly halos. Theodore adjusted the car's heater, more out of habit than necessity. His thoughts drifted between memories of the past and reflections on his present when something caught his eye just beyond the glow of his headlights. Initially, he believed his vision was deceiving him. Beneath the faint light of a street lamp, he made out a small figure standing alone. He eased the car to a stop, leaning forward over the wheel for a closer look. The sight of a young boy, no older than 7, clutching a bundle wrapped in a worn blanket, a baby, shook his heart. He thought, this can't be real, as he parked the car at the curb. Logic advised him to contact the police and avoid the situation. But something about the scene stirred emotions he hadn't felt in years. The fragility of those children, alone on such a freezing night, awakened a part of him he thought had long been dormant. Impulsively, he turned off the engine and activated the hazard lights. "What are you doing, Theodore?" he asked himself as his hand moved to the door handle. He didn't have an answer, but for the first time in years, he was acting on instinct rather than calculated logic. Stepping out of the car, the cold hit him like a slap. He pulled his cashmere coat tighter around him and walked slowly toward the children, trying not to appear intimidating. The older boy watched him with a mix of fear and desperation, holding the baby close to his chest in a protective gesture. "Hi?" Theodore said, surprised at the gentleness in his own voice. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" The boy didn't respond, but his wide, dark eyes told a story Theodore could sense was filled with pain. The baby stirred in the boy's arms, letting out a faint whimper. The boy's clothes were dirty and far too thin for the harsh winter chill. His shoes, worn out and soaked, barely offered any protection against the cold. Theodore noticed the boy shivering, even though he tried his best to hide it. They can't stay here, Theodore thought, as a wave of genuine concern washed over him. "Come with me," he said, almost without thinking, extending his hand. "It's too cold out here. I'll take you somewhere safe and warm." The words spilled out before he could fully process them, surprising both him and the boy. Slowly, the boy stood up, still holding the baby tightly in his arms. His movements were hesitant, almost as if he had been waiting for someone to show up, but wasn't entirely sure he could trust the help being offered. Theodore opened the back door of his Ferrari, turning the heat up to its highest setting. Carefully, he helped the boy climb in, noting how light and fragile he seemed. The car's luxurious interior starkly contrasted with the children's disheveled appearance, making the entire situation feel surreal. As Theodore drove toward his mansion, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The boy stared out the window, clutching the now peacefully sleeping baby close to his chest. The silence inside the car was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and unanswered thoughts. "My name's Theodore," he finally said, breaking the tension. "What's your name?" The boy stayed silent, but for a brief moment, their eyes met in the mirror. In them, Theodore saw a mixture of fear, hope, and a maturity far beyond the boy's years. City lights blurred past as Theodore drove, his mind racing with a whirlwind of thoughts. Was this even legal? Was it wise? What was he going to do next? For the first time in decades, he acted based on instinct rather than logic, even though he didn't know the answers. As the gates to his mansion opened automatically and the driveway lights illuminated the grand estate, Theodore wondered if tonight, for the first time, this empty house could become more than just a symbol of his success. Parking in front of the main entrance, he felt a growing awareness that his life was about to take an unexpected turn. The impulsive decision he had made was about to spark a profound change, not just for him, but also for the children fate had placed in his path. Mrs. Margaret, his housekeeper of more than a decade, stood in the foyer as they entered. Her initial shock at seeing Theodore with two children in such a precarious state was quickly masked by her usual professionalism. "Mr. Gross, we weren't expecting you back so soon," she said calmly, though her eyes kept drifting toward the children. "Mrs. Margaret, I need a guest room prepared," Theodore instructed as he helped the boy inside. "And please, a hot bath and some food." His voice wavered slightly, betraying his own uncertainty about what he was doing. The boy, still holding the baby tightly, looked around the opulent interior with a mix of awe and suspicion. "Mariella," Mrs. Margaret called to one of the staff passing by, "prepare the blue room and bring fresh towels and new linens." She turned to Theodore with a look that blended worry and curiosity. "I called a doctor to check on the children, sir," she said. Theodore nodded, grateful for her quick thinking and efficiency. The warmth of the mansion began to thaw the chill that had settled into the children's bones. The older boy, still clutching the baby tightly, watched everyone's movements with wary, alert eyes. Theodore knelt in front of him, trying to make eye contact. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked gently. The boy avoided his gaze, remaining silent. Moments later, Mrs. Margaret returned with a soft blanket in hand. "The bath is ready, sir," she announced. "I found some clothes stored away from the cook's nephew. They should fit the older boy." She approached the child cautiously. "Sweetheart, would you let me help with the baby while you take a bath?" For the first time, the boy visibly reacted, holding the baby tighter and stepping back. Theodore stepped in quickly. "It's okay. No one is going to separate you," he reassured him. "Mrs. Margaret just wants to help." The boy's posture relaxed slightly, though the mistrust in his eyes lingered. 30 minutes later, Dr. Alexander arrived. The older boy, now bathed and dressed in clean clothes, sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of warm soup in front of him. The baby, freshly cleaned and changed, was sleeping peacefully in a makeshift bassinet. "Good evening, Theodore," the doctor greeted as he stepped in. A long-time family friend, he had come as quickly as he could. "I was told it was urgent." After examining the children, Dr. Alexander shared his findings with Theodore in private. "They're malnourished and a bit dehydrated, but otherwise healthy. The older one shows signs of stress and exhaustion, and the baby will need nutritional support. But with proper care, both should recover fully." Theodore cut in before the doctor could ask further. "I found them on the street alone in the cold. I couldn't just leave them there." Dr. Alexander nodded, though concern was evident on his face. "I understand, Theodore, but you need to report this to the authorities. These children might have someone looking for them." The night wore on, as Theodore watched the children sleep in the guest room. The older boy refused to leave the baby's side, so Mrs. Margaret had placed a crib next to the bed. "Sir," she said quietly from the doorway, "have you thought about what to do tomorrow?" Theodore ran a tired hand over his face. "I don't know, Magali," he admitted, using her first name for the first time in years. "I know I should call the police, but there's something about these kids, something that tells me they need protection." Mrs. Margaret stepped closer, her gaze softening as she looked at the sleeping children. "The boy hasn't spoken a word, yet his eyes convey a wealth of information," she remarked. "I've seen that look before, sir. It's the look of someone who's been through too much." After a brief pause, she added, "Do you want me to stay in the room tonight with them?" "Please," Theodore replied, appreciating her understanding. As he retired to his study, the events of the evening replayed in his mind. His meticulously organized and controlled life had been upended in just a few hours. By all accounts, he should have been worried, or even regretting his impulsive decision. But instead, he felt an unexpected sense of peace. Pouring himself a whiskey, he sank into his favorite armchair. The mansion, usually quiet at this hour, felt strangely different. The presence of the children had shifted something essential in the atmosphere. "What have I gotten myself into?" Theodore muttered under his breath, the question growing into a genuine concern. That night, he barely slept, his mind consumed by thoughts of the kids and the choices he'd have to face the next day. Every so often, he got up to check on the little ones, finding comfort in the steady rhythm of their breathing. By the early hours, he was in the kitchen, sipping coffee as he waited for the first light of dawn. Mrs. Margaret joined him quietly, pouring herself a cup without a word. There was no need for conversation. Both understood that the coming hours would bring pivotal decisions, not just for their lives, but for those of the mysterious children fate had placed in their path. "Breakfast will be ready in an hour," Mrs. Margaret finally said, breaking the silence. "The kids will need a good meal." Theodore nodded, grateful for her steady presence and her ability to maintain a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. As the sun began to rise, marking the start of a new day, Theodore couldn't yet know it was also the start of a new chapter in his life. The story continued as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the Gross mansion, where Theodore prepared for a day that promised to be as challenging as it was transformative. Upstairs, the children slept, unaware of the decisions being made about their future. Meanwhile, the once lonely millionaire began to feel, for the first time in years, that his life had a purpose beyond the figures in his bank account. Breakfast that morning became an eye-opening moment. For the first time in years, Theodore sat in the main dining room, observing as the older child, who had yet to utter a word, fed the baby with surprising skill. "He's done this before," Theodore remarked softly, hoping to spark a conversation. The boy glanced up briefly before returning to his task. Mrs. Margaret moved efficiently around the kitchen, preparing more baby food and ensuring there was plenty of hot breakfast for everyone. "Sir," she said quietly as she passed by, "I found some children's clothes in the attic from when your nephew used to visit. I've put them in the wash." Theodore nodded, appreciative of her foresight. By mid-morning, the sound of the mansion's doorbell echoed through the halls. Theodore's heart sank when Mrs. Margaret announced the arrival of social services. A middle-aged woman with a kind but serious expression introduced herself as Elizabeth Harper, a social worker. "Mr. Gross, we need to discuss the children you found last night," she said. The conversation in the study was tense. "I understand your concern," Mrs. Harper explained, "but you have to realize that we can't simply allow anyone to take in children found on the street, no matter how good their intentions." Theodore clenched his fists beneath his desk, feeling a strong, inexplicable resistance to the idea of giving up the kids. Throughout the day, the mansion bustled with officials and authorities, each bringing more questions than answers. The older boy stayed close to the baby, silently watching from the shadows, tensing each time someone unfamiliar got too near. "Mark," the boy whispered unexpectedly during dinner when Theodore, for what felt like the 100th time, gently asked for his name. "And the baby?" In the days that followed, an odd but comforting routine settled into place. Mark slowly started to relax, although he remained fiercely protective of the baby. Theodore watched, captivated, as the boy took care of the little one with a maturity far beyond his years, expertly changing diapers and preparing bottles as if he'd been doing it his whole life. The once cold and formal mansion began to shift in small but meaningful ways. Toys now appeared in the corners, baby blankets draped across designer sofas, and the occasional sound of childish giggles filled the hallways. Theodore found himself adjusting his schedule, cutting back on meetings and delegating tasks more frequently. Evenings had taken on a new rhythm. Instead of working late in his study, Theodore often found himself sitting in the children's room, watching them sleep. Mark occasionally had nightmares, and Theodore learned to recognize the signs: the slight trembling, the frightened murmurs, the small hands clutching at the sheets. Mrs. Margaret became an irreplaceable part of this new chapter. Her familiarity with children and innate maternal instincts significantly alleviated the challenges of those initial days. "They need stability," she told Theodore one evening. "More than anything, they need to feel safe here." Efforts to uncover the children's past led nowhere. The authorities found no records matching their descriptions, and Mark remained silent about where they came from. Whenever anyone asked, he would shut down completely, holding the baby as if they were his sole anchor in an unsteady world. Theodore began noticing subtle things about Mark: the way he checked the exits of every room, how loud noises startled him, and the constant sense of vigilance in his demeanor. "These are signs of trauma," the child psychologist Theodore had hired explained. "He'll need time and patience to feel truly secure." Mornings quickly became Theodore's favorite time of day. Watching Mark feed the baby with growing confidence, hearing the baby's occasional happy babbles, and seeing the tension in Mark's shoulders slowly ease. All of it felt like a series of small but significant Vincentes. The mansion staff adapted surprisingly well to the children's presence. The gardener showed Mark the flowers in the garden, the cook always had freshly baked cookies ready, and even the stoic security guards softened, occasionally breaking into smiles when the baby giggled. One afternoon, while Theodore worked in his study, he heard something that made him pause. Mark was softly singing to the baby. It was a simple lullaby, barely above a whisper, but it marked a significant step in the boy's emotional openness. Theodore stood motionless, listening, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. No one failed to notice Theodore's transformation. His business partners remarked on his shifted priorities, his employees commented on his newfound gentleness, and even his face seemed to have lost some of its characteristic sternness. The children were melting away years of emotional distance. The search for their origins continued, but with each update from the authorities, Theodore found himself growing more apprehensive. The thought of losing the children now felt unbearable. The thought that someone might come forward to claim the children stirred a kind of anxiety Theodore had never felt before. To his surprise, he realized just how deeply attached he had become to them. Mrs. Margaret was the first to voice what everyone else had begun to sense. "They've become a family," she said one evening to Theodore as they watched Mark sleeping beside the baby. "I've never seen you like this, sir. These children have brought life into this house, and more importantly, life into your eyes." Theodore couldn't deny the truth in her words. Each passing day deepened his bond with the children. Mark had started seeking his presence whenever he was scared. The baby lit up with smiles whenever Theodore entered a room, and Theodore himself found his thoughts constantly drifting to their well-being, planning their future. Sitting in his favorite chair, Theodore reflected on how much his life had changed. The once quiet mansion, a symbol of his solitude, now echoed with the sounds of something new and precious, a family. Yet, a shadow of unease loomed in his mind, as though this newfound peace might be more fragile than it appeared. At dawn, the doorbell rang with unusual urgency. Mrs. Margaret, already awake preparing breakfast, hurried to answer it. She opened the door to find 2 police officers flashing their badges. "Good morning. I'm Officer David Thompson, and this is my partner, Officer Sandra Brooks. We need to speak with Mr. Gross immediately." Alerted by the butler, Theodore descended the stairs, adjusting his robe. The tension in the air was palpable as the officers stood in the foyer, their serious expressions hinting at unwelcome news. "Mr. Gross," Officer Thompson began, "we're here regarding a report of a possible child abduction." The color drained from Theodore's face as he heard the accusation. The officers explained that a witness had reported seeing a man in a luxury car picking up 2 children off a downtown street. "I understand how this must sound," Theodore replied, keeping his composure, "but I found them abandoned. They were alone, freezing in the street." Officer Brooks, sharp-eyed and observant, studied Theodore's every reaction. "We need to see the children," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Just then, Mark appeared at the top of the staircase, holding the baby in his arms. His eyes widened at the sight of strangers, and Theodore noticed how he instinctively stepped back into the shadows. "It's okay, Mark," Theodore called out gently, though his heart pounded in his chest. Mrs. Margaret quickly ascended the stairs to be with the children, her presence offering a reassuring sense of safety. The officers exchanged significant glances, clearly noting the bond between Theodore and the kids. The morning turned into a whirlwind of questions and paperwork. The officers photographed the children, interviewed the household staff, and scrutinized every detail of the situation. Theodore watched the proceedings with a mix of anxiety and frustration, acutely aware that every moment could alter the fate of the delicate family he had begun to build. Sandra Brooks eventually pulled Theodore aside while her partner continued the investigation. "Mr. Gross, do you have any idea why these children might have been out there alone that night?" Her tone was gentler now, almost sympathetic. "I've been trying to figure that out," Theodore replied. "But Mark doesn't talk about his past, and the baby is far too young to tell us anything." There was a palpable tension in the mansion. The staff moved cautiously, casting uneasy glances toward the library, where Mark had secluded himself with the baby. Theodore noticed the boy's guarded demeanor had returned, as if he were bracing himself for someone to take the baby away at any moment. "We need to dig deeper," the officer said, tucking his notebook into his pocket. "For now, the children can stay here, but we'll be monitoring the situation closely." His words offered temporary relief, but the underlying tone of warning wasn't lost on Theodore. In an effort to maintain a semblance of normalcy, Mrs. Margaret prepared tea for everyone in the main sitting room. Theodore watched Mark, huddled in his secure corner, his eyes fixed on the officers with an intensity that tore at Theodore's heart. What had this child endured to develop such deep mistrust? Before leaving, Officer Sandra Brooks paused, her gaze lingering on Mark with a thoughtful expression. "There's more to this," she murmured, almost to herself. "These kids' behavior suggests a far more complex story than what is initially apparent." After the officers left, the tension remained palpable. Mark refused to let go of the baby, and any attempt to approach him triggered visible panic. Theodore felt helpless, watching the progress of the past few weeks unravel under the weight of renewed fear. As night fell, a restless quiet descended on the mansion. Theodore sat in his study, replaying the day's events in his mind. The police investigation had unearthed questions he'd been avoiding. Who were these children? Where had they come from? Why had they been left alone that fateful night? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Mrs. Margaret, her usually composed face etched with concern. "Sir, there's something you should see," she said softly, handing him an old newspaper. The headline told of a family that had vanished years ago, and the accompanying photograph made Theodore's heart skip a beat. Later that night, Officer Brooks called again. "Mr. Gross, we've found something," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "You need to be prepared. Things are about to get much more complicated." Theodore's spine tingled as he took in her words. Outside, the mansion's guard dogs broke the stillness with sudden, sharp barks, startling everyone inside. Theodore rushed to the children's room, his heart pounding. Mark was awake, his wide, frightened eyes glinting in the dim light. He clutched the baby protectively, as though his very survival depended on it. "I won't let anyone hurt you," Theodore vowed, sitting beside the bed and placing a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder. The boy looked at him, and for the first time, Theodore saw not just fear, but a glimmer of hope in his eyes. That look carried an unspoken promise Theodore wasn't sure he could fulfill, but he was determined to try, no matter the cost. As he glanced out the window of the children's room, he watched the security guards patrolling the grounds. The moonlight bathed the garden in a pale glow, casting shadows that seemed to dance among the trees. In the quiet of the night, the children's hidden past waited to surface, and Theodore understood that facing it might change everything. Detective Sandra Brooks arrived at the mansion early the next morning, carrying a thick folder under her arm. Her expression was serious as she was led to Theodore's study. "What I'm about to show you will completely reshape how we see this case," she said, placing the folder on Theodore's desk. "We've been digging into your past, Mr. Gross, specifically your business history." Theodore watched as Sandra opened the folder, revealing old photographs and documents. "Vincent Blackwood," she uttered, the name striking Theodore deeply. "You remember him?" The question was rhetorical. The color drained from Theodore's face instantly. It was a name he hadn't heard in years, a name tied to a chapter of his life he wished to bury. 10 years ago, Sandra continued, spreading out a series of old newspaper clippings, you and Blackwood were locked in a fierce business rivalry, a rivalry that ended with the complete collapse of the Blackwood empire. He lost everything. His company, his wealth, his reputation. Theodore sank into his chair, memories of that time flooding back. Sandra pulled out a more recent photograph, blurry but unmistakable. "Blackwood didn't vanish, Mr. Gross. He reinvented himself under a false identity, lived abroad, and has been watching you, waiting for the right moment to strike." The revelation hit Theodore like a physical blow. He started to say, "You're suggesting the children." But the words stuck in his throat. The children are part of a plan that's been years in the making. Mark and the baby, they're Blackwood grandchildren. His daughter and her husband died under suspicious circumstances 6 months ago. The children disappeared that same night. Theodore began to understand Mark's silence, his constant vigilance, and his mistrust of strangers. Theodore stood abruptly, walking toward the window. From there, he could see Mark in the garden, watching over the baby as they played on a blanket. "All this time," he murmured, "they've been running from him." Sandra stepped closer, her tone softer now. "We believe Blackwood intends to use the children to destroy you, Mr. Gross. The question is, how?" The morning turned into an intense planning session. The police set up additional security measures around the mansion, while Theodore struggled to comprehend the weight of the situation. His stomach churned at the thought of the children being part of a vendetta, but it also strengthened his resolve to protect them. Lunch was a tense affair. Theodore studied Mark with fresh eyes, wondering how much the boy knew, how much he'd witnessed. The child seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, his eyes darting between Theodore and the windows, as if expecting danger to strike at any moment. Later, Mrs. Margaret joined the conversation, sharing her insights about the children's routines. "Mark has nightmares almost every night," she revealed. "Sometimes he cries out a name. Grandpa? No. I never thought much of it until now." Theodore's heart ached at the revelation. How much trauma had this little boy endured? Sandra spent the afternoon reviewing security footage from recent weeks. "There's been suspicious activity," she pointed out, showing several images of a dark car repeatedly passing by the mansion. Blackwood stood near, observing and anticipating the ideal moment. The invisible threat that had been lurking in the shadows was finally taking shape. The night brought an unsettling calm, a silence that felt almost too heavy. Theodore decided to sleep on the couch in the children's room, unable to leave them alone. He watched them sleep, their peaceful faces a stark contrast to the storm raging in his mind. These little ones, originally meant to be tools in his pursuit of revenge, had become the most precious part of his life. Just after midnight, Mark woke up screaming. Theodore was by his side in seconds, holding him tightly as the boy shook uncontrollably. "He's here," Mark whispered between sobs, the first words he had spoken in days. "Grandpa is here." Theodore tightened his embrace, silently vowing that no one would harm these children ever again. Leave a comment tart if you're touched by Theodore's love for the kids. At dawn, Officer Brooks received an urgent call. Her face turned pale as she listened. "Blackwood has been spotted in town," she informed Theodore, "and he's not alone. He's gathered former employees from his company, people who also blame you for their downfall." The threat was growing, becoming more dangerous with every passing hour. Theodore called an emergency meeting with his security team. Plans were drawn, measures were tightened, but everyone knew they were dealing with a man who had spent years planning his revenge. A man with nothing left to lose, and a world of bitterness driving him. That afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived, a former employee of Blackwood, now remorseful, offering critical information. "It's not just about the kids," he revealed. "Blackwood wants you to suffer as he did. He wants you to feel the helplessness of watching everything you've built fall apart." Theodore listened, his resolve hardening with each word. Sandra worked tirelessly, connecting dots and uncovering patterns. "He's been moving money," she reported. "Large sums through ghost accounts. He's funding something big, Mr. Gross, and whatever it is, it's happening soon." The invisible threat was beginning to materialize, yet it remained elusive. Theodore spent hours in his study, poring over old files from his past encounters with Blackwood. Every decision he'd made, every strategic move he'd executed, now felt like it was coming back to haunt him. The burden of guilt and responsibility weighed heavily on him. Late that night, the security cameras caught suspicious movement. A shadowy figure moved too quickly to be identified, but left enough of a trace to put everyone on high alert. The message was clear. Blackwood was playing with them, showing he could strike whenever he pleased. Theodore sat by the children's bed as the moon cast eerie shadows through the reinforced windows. The truth had come to light, but with it came a greater danger than he had anticipated. In the darkness, he made a silent promise. He would protect these children with his life, no matter the cost. Blackwood vengeance might tear down everything he had built, but Theodore would not let it touch the children. Not this time. Morning broke with a lingering unease that Theodore couldn't shake. Officer Brooks arrived early, her face etched with exhaustion, the toll of a sleepless night evident. Gross spoke in a hushed tone. "We've uncovered something alarming. Information about the children has been leaking from inside the mansion." The revelation struck with lightning on a clear day. The police laid out several photographs and transcripts of phone calls. These documents revealed regular communications between someone inside the house and Blackwood. "The traitor knows every move, every routine, every security measure we've put in place," Sandra explained, her voice heavy with concern. When Sandra uttered the name Mrs. Margaret, Theodore felt a shift beneath him. The housekeeper, his most trusted employee for over a decade, had been working for Blackwood all along. The evidence was indisputable. Photos, recordings, call logs. In the kitchen, Mrs. Margaret was preparing breakfast as if it were any other morning, oblivious that her cover had been blown. Theodore watched her from the doorway, struggling to reconcile the image of the woman who had cared for his home for years with that of a traitor who had endangered 2 innocent children. Confrontation was inevitable. Theodore and Sandra found Mrs. Margaret in her room, hurriedly packing a suitcase. "Why?" was all Theodore could manage, his voice breaking under the weight of betrayal. The woman's face crumbled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He has something on me," she confessed between sobs. "He threatened to ruin not just my life, but my family's as well. He showed me evidence, documents. I had no choice." Her words hung hollow in the tense silence as Theodore struggled to contain his anger and pain. Sandra took charge, handcuffing Mrs. Margaret while reading her rights. The woman didn't resist, but her tear-filled eyes pleaded with Theodore. "I never wanted the children to get hurt," she whispered. "Please, believe me." Mark, who had been silently watching from the shadows, stepped into the doorway. His gaze locked with Mrs. Margaret's, and in that moment, something shifted in his expression. He experienced a sudden loss of trust, which confirmed his deepest apprehensions about adults. The police subjected Mrs. Margaret to an intense interrogation. She revealed critical details about Blackwood's plans, information she had been leaking for weeks. "He's planning something big," she warned through tears, "something that will destroy everything." Theodore spent the rest of the day overhauling the mansion's security, changing codes, reinforcing protocols. Every corner Mrs. Margaret had access to had to be reassessed. Every routine she had observed needed to be altered. The remaining staff underwent rigorous background checks. Paranoia seeped into the mansion like a thick fog, turning every glance, every gesture, every word into something to be scrutinized and questioned. Mark became even more withdrawn after Mrs. Margaret's betrayal. His wary eyes tracked everyone who entered a room, his distrust reaching new heights. The baby, sensing the tension, cried more frequently. Sandra worked tirelessly, piecing together the information Mrs. Margaret had provided. "Blackwood has consistently outpaced us," Sandra informed Theodore. "He knew exactly how we'd move, because he had a spy right at the heart of your home." The nights grew especially tense, weighed down by the knowledge that the enemy had been closer than they could have imagined. Theodore struggled to sleep, splitting his time between monitoring the children and analyzing the security footage. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, and every sound hinted at impending danger. The mansion, which had briefly served as a sanctuary for Mark and the baby, now felt more like a besieged fortress. The once playful gardens were now under constant surveillance, patrolled by armed guards. The weight of betrayal pressed heavily on Theodore's shoulders. He found himself questioning every choice he had made and every person he had trusted. Mrs. Margaret had been more than just an employee. She was a constant presence in his life, someone he could rely on in his loneliest moments. That night, Theodore found Mark sitting by his bedroom window, gazing out at the darkened gardens. "Sometimes the people we think we know surprise us," he said quietly. Mark turned to him and for the first time opened up about his past. "Like Grandpa," he whispered. Later, Theodore sat in his study, holding an old photograph taken during a Christmas party. It showed him with Mrs. Margaret, a symbol of trust and loyalty that now felt tainted by her betrayal. The image served as a stark reminder that in the war Blackwood had started, no one could be trusted completely. Ominous forebodings filled the Gross mansion as night fell like a heavy shroud. Security guards patrolled the grounds more frequently since the betrayal was uncovered. Theodore stayed awake in his study, poring over security reports again and again. The alarm systems had been upgraded and reinforced at every potential entry point. The air in the house was thick with tension, almost tangible, growing heavier with each passing minute. Security monitors flickered with black and white images of the property. Earlier that week, Sandra Brooks had personally installed additional cameras in key areas. The surveillance team kept a close watch on every movement in and around the mansion. Yet despite all the precautions, Theodore couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Years of business experience had taught him to trust his instincts. At 2:15 a.m., the first signs of trouble began to surface. The security system started failing one by one in a disturbingly deliberate pattern. The exterior cameras went dark, in a systematic sequence, creating strategic blind spots. Guards reported interference with their radios, making communication nearly impossible. Blackwood's meticulously crafted plan was beginning to unfold. Theodore instinctively moved toward the children's room, his heart pounding in his chest. The main hallway was unnervingly dark. Even the emergency lights weren't working. Muffled footsteps and hushed voices began echoing from various parts of the mansion. Suddenly, the main electrical system failed, plunging the house into total darkness. The controlled chaos Blackwood had orchestrated was now fully underway. When Theodore reached the children's room, Mark was already awake, holding the baby protectively in his arms. His eyes glimmered in the darkness with a mix of fear and determination far beyond his years. The boy had developed an uncanny sense of danger after everything he'd endured. Theodore shut the door silently behind him, moving cautiously in the dim light. The moonlight streaming through the windows cast eerie shadows on the walls. Minutes later, Sandra Brooks burst into the room, her weapon drawn and ready. A fresh cut on her left cheek trickled blood, evidence of a recent struggle etched on her face. The men under Blackwood had taken down most of the guards with near-military precision. The outer perimeter was entirely breached, and the attackers moved with chilling efficiency. The mansion was being infiltrated from multiple entry points at once. "We need to get them out of here," Sandra whispered urgently, keeping her voice steady to avoid alarming the children. The evacuation plan they had prepared was now useless. Every major exit was blocked. Theodore could hear footsteps drawing closer down the main hallway on the second floor. The attackers moved with the kind of coordination that came from meticulous planning over months. Time was slipping away as their options grew slimmer. Suddenly, the baby started crying, a sound that seemed deafening in the tense silence of the night. Mark tried desperately to calm him, his small hands trembling as he rocked his brother. Theodore and Sandra exchanged a worried look. The baby's cries could easily give away their location. The footsteps in the hallway paused briefly, as though the intruders were trying to pinpoint the sound. Theodore's heart pounded so loudly that he feared it might betray them as well. "There's a passage," he whispered, suddenly remembering a detail about the mansion's original design. The old blueprints showed a tunnel system connecting the house to the outside, built during Prohibition for smuggling. The entrance was hidden behind a panel in the closet of the adjoining room. Those tunnels, once used to transport contraband, might now be their only chance at survival. Sandra nodded, immediately understanding the plan without needing further explanation. She moved silently toward the door, prepared to cover their advance into the adjacent room. Meanwhile, the methodical search conducted by Blackwood men grew louder, creeping closer. Theodore carefully took the baby from Mark's arms, motioning for the boy to stay close. The time to act had come. Crossing into the next room felt like an eternity, every creak of the wooden floorboards as loud as a gunshot in the quiet night. Mark moved with surprising agility, his years of heightened anxiety serving him well. Sandra took up the rear, her weapon trained on the hallway behind them. Miraculously, the baby had quieted, as if sensing the dire nature of the situation. Theodore found the hidden panel without much difficulty, his fingers searching the wood for the mechanism. Dust, untouched for decades, fell as he worked to open the concealed passage, praying it still functioned. Finally, the panel slid open with a faint creak, revealing a dark, musty tunnel. The stale air carried with it the scent of forgotten secrets. Just as they were about to step inside, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Theodore." Vincent Blackwood emerged from the shadows of the hallway, his figure illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight. His face bore the marks of years spent plotting his revenge, and he held a gun with the calm confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times. "You don't have to do this, Vincent," Theodore said, striving to keep his voice steady as he positioned himself between Blackwood and the children. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Sandra kept her gun aimed at Blackwood, but the appearance of more armed men in the hallway made the situation even more precarious. Mark clung tightly to Theodore's leg, his small frame shaking, but his spirit unwavering. What followed unfolded in a whirlwind of chaos. Sandra fired first, her bullet grazing Blackwood's shoulder. Blackwood men retaliated with a storm of bullets, forcing everyone to scramble for cover. Theodore shielded Mark with his body, pushing him toward the tunnel while cradling the baby in his arms. The room erupted into pure mayhem, gunfire ricocheting off the walls. Sandra held back the attackers with precise shots, giving Theodore and the children a chance to retreat toward the tunnel. Blackwood, wounded but relentless, pressed forward, his face twisted in a mix of pain and fierce determination. Screams and gunfire blended into a chaotic symphony of violence. Time appeared to simultaneously expand and constrict. Mark's remarkable courage shone through as he guided Theodore through the dimly lit tunnel, as though he'd been preparing for this moment his entire life. The sounds of the battle faded as they moved deeper into the underground passage. The baby, astonishingly calm, seemed to sense the need for silence. When they finally reached the tunnel's exit, they were met with debris blocking the way, but adrenaline drove them to clear a path. The cool night air greeted them as they emerged several hundred feet from the mansion. Distant sirens signaled the arrival of reinforcements. The battle raged on in the mansion, the muffled gunfire echoing faintly in the distance. Sandra joined them moments later, breathless and visibly battered, but alive. "Blackwood is neutralized," she managed to say between gasps, "but his men are still in the mansion." Headlights from a tactical team's vehicles pierced through the darkness as they approached rapidly. Though the night was far from over, the children were finally safe. Theodore pulled Mark into a tight embrace while holding the baby, tears streaming down his face. Suppressed emotions surfaced as the adrenaline wore off. Everything Theodore had built might now lie in ruins, but what truly mattered was secure in his arms. Blackwood's revenge had failed at its most crucial goal. It hadn't torn them apart. Mark broke his silence, whispering words that struck Theodore's heart. "I knew you'd protect us." The boy, who had endured so much pain and shouldered such a heavy burden, had finally found someone he could trust without question. The baby snuggled closer, as if affirming his brother's words. In the distance, the first light of dawn began to break. Police helicopters circled overhead as tactical teams secured the mansion. The battle was over, leaving behind a trail of destruction and irreversible change. But as Theodore held the children under the brightening sky, he felt something new and stronger, rising from the ashes of the night. True family isn't defined by blood. It's about love and the willingness to protect those who rely on you. By dawn, Theodore and the children had been moved to a safe house provided by the authorities. Its plain white walls, starkly different from the mansion's opulence, offered something far more precious: safety. Sandra Brooks was busy coordinating with multiple teams from the main room, closely monitoring the situation unfolding at the mansion. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson was personally leading Blackwood interrogation at the Central Police Station. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the night, they carried the promise of long-awaited answers. Mark slept soundly on a worn-out couch, his small frame finally succumbing to exhaustion. The baby lay in a makeshift crib, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had once again turned their lives upside down. Nearby, Theodore sat in a chair, keeping watch over the children. The dark circles under his eyes revealed the toll of a sleepless night. His mind relentlessly replayed the events that had brought them to this moment. Brooks quietly entered the room, a cup of coffee in her hand, which she offered to Theodore. Her eyes reflected a mix of fatigue and determination as she took a seat across from him. The initial interrogation of Blackwood had uncovered disturbing details about his plans. His obsession with revenge had consumed his life for years. Every step of his scheme had been methodically crafted with a chilling precision. Preliminary forensic reports from the mansion began to filter in. They had discovered a fully operational surveillance hub hidden in an abandoned house nearby. Boxes of documents detailing Theodore's movements over the years were stacked high. Photos of the children, dating back to when they were much younger, plastered the walls. The depth of Blackwood fixation was terrifying. With a start, Mark woke up, his wide, frightened eyes scanning the room until they landed on Theodore. The boy got up and walked toward him, seeking comfort in his presence. Sandra observed the interaction with a bittersweet smile, recognizing the profound bond that had formed. In the crib, the baby began to stir, as if sensing the absence of his brother. New reports kept streaming in, revealing that Blackwood's network was far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Former employees, people whose lives had been ruined when his company fell, had joined forces with him out of bitterness and resentment. The mansion itself bore significant damage from the standoff. The tunnels they had used to escape turned out to be part of a vast underground network. Blackwood had accounted for every detail in his plan, every detail except one: Theodore's unwavering love for the children. By mid-morning, Officer Thompson arrived with critical updates from the interrogation. Blackwood had confessed everything, his resistance finally shattered by the failure of his plans. The deaths of his daughter and son-in-law were no accident. Contrary to what everyone had believed, the children were the last witnesses who could testify about what truly happened that night. The long-buried truth was finally surfacing from the shadows of the past. Mark listened intently, his small hand gripping Theodore's sleeve for reassurance. Blackwood's confession painted a grim picture of obsession and madness. Sandra took detailed notes, carefully building a case to ensure Blackwood could never again pose a threat to the children. The baby, still oblivious to the monumental revelations, slept peacefully in his crib. Meanwhile, the forensic teams continued to comb through the evidence at both the mansion and Blackwood's hidden lair, piecing together the full extent of his elaborate, twisted scheme. Every new discovery contributed to the intricate puzzle of years of meticulous planning. The documents uncovered laid bare the full scope of the surveillance network. Photographs, detailed reports, blueprints, and schedules highlighted just how meticulously everything had been orchestrated. Blackwood's relentless determination to destroy Theodore was undeniable. Sandra presented a preliminary report on the damage sustained by the Gross mansion. The main areas had suffered significant destruction during the confrontation. A complete overhaul of the security systems would be necessary. The East Wing, where the children's bedrooms were located, had withstood the worst of the attack. Forensic teams continued sifting through the rubble, gathering evidence. Theodore sat quietly, absent-mindedly running his fingers through Mark's hair. The boy had refused to leave his side since arriving at the safe house. The baby slept soundly in his arms, a comforting weight anchoring his thoughts in the present. The events of the previous night now appeared as a distant nightmare in the daylight. Everyone in the room was starting to feel the effects of exhaustion. Officer Thompson returned with more details from Blackwood's interrogation. The full confession revealed years of obsessive, calculated planning. The network of accomplices was far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. The ripple effects of the case would touch individuals at all levels of society. Blackwood's downfall would inevitably drag many others down with him. Investigators had uncovered documents linking him to additional crimes. The deaths of his daughter and son-in-law were just the beginning. His obsession with revenge had left a trail of victims over the years. The children were the only ones to survive his madness. The full truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Mark started speaking, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. He described the night his parents were killed, recounting details he had long buried out of fear. Sandra recorded every word, while Theodore held him protectively. The child's testimony would be crucial in ensuring Blackwood never walked free. Mark's bravery shone through his pain. Meanwhile, news crews began gathering outside the secure perimeter. The story of Blackwood, the vengeful millionaire, and the children who survived his reign of terror had captured nationwide attention. Theodore anticipated a barrage of questions and cameras during the media frenzy, but his top priority was to protect the children from harm. Theodore's legal team worked tirelessly to expedite the adoption process. Recent events had underscored the urgent need for formal legal custody. Sandra provided her testimony in support of Theodore's capabilities as a father. The judge assigned to the case was reviewing the documents with urgency. The children's safety and stability were the top priorities. As the evening set in, the news everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The judge issued an immediate temporary custody order in Theodore's favor. Blackwood was formally charged with multiple crimes, including murder and attempted kidnapping. His accomplices were being arrested at various locations across the city. The web of revenge was unraveling quickly. Theodore glanced at the children, now officially under his legal care. Mark slept soundly on the couch, his face finally reflecting the peace he so richly deserved. The baby slept peacefully in his arms, blissfully oblivious to the legal documents that formalized what Theodore's heart had always known. This rescue was more than just physical. It was the beginning of a real family. Theodore sat between the kids as the last rays of sunlight streamed through the windows. The battle was over, but the journey was just beginning. Sandra and Officer Thompson quietly said their goodbyes, leaving this new family to start their healing process. Blackwood's revenge had failed spectacularly. Instead of leaving destruction in its wake, it had created something beautiful and strong. Returning to the Gross estate 3 weeks after the showdown with Blackwood was a milestone moment. Construction crews had worked tirelessly to repair the damage, and the new security systems were state-of-the-art, far superior to anything they'd had before. Every staff member had been meticulously vetted and re-vetted. This time, Theodore was not taking any chances. Holding Mark's hand, he walked through the newly renovated halls of the estate. The boy now moved with a confidence that was previously absent, his small shoulders no longer weighed down by constant fear. The baby, carried by a carefully screened nanny, babbled happily. The adoption paperwork was progressing swiftly, thanks in part to testimonies from Sandra Cartio and Officer Thompson. Life was slowly finding its rhythm again. The children's rooms had been completely redone, transformed into safe, welcoming spaces. Theodore personally oversaw every detail, making sure they reflected his kids' growing personalities. Mark now had his own library, stocked with books he devoured, with an eagerness that was a joy to watch. The baby's room was bright and cheerful, equipped with cutting-edge monitoring systems. Though the media was still chasing the full story, Theodore ensured his family remained shielded from the frenzy. Headlines about Blackwood's downfall and the collapse of his criminal network were beginning to fade from front pages. Sandra visited often, not just as a cop, but as a trusted friend. Her presence became a welcome part of the family's new normal. Days transformed into a cozy routine, radically different from the solitary existence Theodore previously experienced. Mornings began with family breakfasts, filled with laughter and plans for the day ahead. Theodore's businesses continued to thrive, but he delegated more now, prioritizing time with his children. Afternoons were spent playing, reading, and sharing quiet moments that strengthened their bond each day. Mark started therapy to work through his past traumas. His nightmares became less frequent, and his smile more common. The baby thrived, growing happy and healthy, surrounded by constant love. Theodore captured every milestone, building a new family album that began the day he found them on the streets. The mansion, once a symbol of solitary success, had transformed into a true home. Children's laughter now filled halls that had previously known only the echo of lonely footsteps. The gardens, once maintained purely for appearances, were now alive with games and picnic spots. The rigid formality of the estate had softened into a warmth that even the most stoic staff members couldn't resist smiling at. The day the final adoption papers arrived, Theodore organized a small gathering. Sandra, Officer Thompson, and a handful of close friends who had been there throughout the process came together to celebrate the milestone. Mark, now officially a gross, kept his emotions in check until Theodore embraced him. In that moment, both let their tears flow freely. Over the months, Mark's nightmares became less frequent. When they did occur, he found immediate comfort in Theodore's constant presence. The baby, now officially named Lucas Gross, grew up surrounded by love and security. Therapy reports showed steady progress in the emotional recovery of both children. Sandra's regular visits became a cherished part of their routine, and her bond with Theodore deepened beyond mere professional friendship. Mark adored her, and she returned the affection with genuine care for both children. Family life transformed into a series of joyful and meaningful moments. Meanwhile, Theodore's business flourished under a more balanced approach. He had come to realize that true success wasn't measured by bank account numbers, but by shared moments and genuine connections. His employees noticed the shift in his leadership, now marked by empathy and a renewed appreciation for family values. This personal growth touched every corner of his life. The scars of the past began to heal, though some would take longer than others. Mark started to speak more openly about his parents, honoring their memory while creating new, happy memories with his family. Lucas, protected by the love around him, grew up free from the traumas that had once haunted his older brother. Theodore discovered a newfound purpose in fatherhood. Every business decision was now weighed against the time it would take away from his children. The values that had once defined his idea of success were completely redefined. His true wealth wasn't stored in bank vaults, but in the moments he spent with his family. The Gross mansion, once a symbol of isolated wealth, became a beacon of transformation within the community. Theodore established a foundation to support children in at-risk situations. Mark became an active participant, using his own experiences to help other kids feel understood. The tragedy that had brought them together became a catalyst for positive change. Eventually, Sandra and Theodore acknowledged the feelings that had grown between them. Their relationship developed naturally, strengthened by their shared experiences and mutual love for the children. Sandra was a natural addition to Mark and Lucas's family, adding to the circle of love and protection they all shared. Quiet evenings became their most cherished times. Theodore often sat in the library, with Mark reading and Lucas playing nearby. In those moments, he felt a peace he had never known in his earlier years. With Sandra now a constant presence, their family became a testament to the resilience and healing power of love. Together, they built a future from the ashes of past pain. The following years brought more positive changes. Mark excelled academically, channeling his intelligence and resilience into remarkable achievements. Lucas grew into a happy, confident child, free from the shadows that had once darkened his brother's childhood. The Gross family rose to prominence as a testament to the power of love to heal even the most profound wounds. The story concludes with a heartwarming scene in the garden. Theodore, Sandra, and the children share an afternoon filled with laughter and play. The shadows of the past have been replaced by the light of unconditional love. The Gross mansion, once a monument to lonely wealth, now shines as a symbol of hope and renewal, reminding everyone that the strongest families are built on love, not blood. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.